This story is titled, Stepbrother Took Dad's Company and My Wife, Leaving Me Disowned. The truth has finally comes out after 9 years. Growing up, I always knew Lucas was the favorite. It wasn't even subtle. My dad would bend over backward for him. And I was, well, just there. Let me explain a bit. Lucas isn't my biological brother. He's my stepbrother. My mom passed away when I was 7, and my dad remarried a few years later. Lucas came into my life when I was 10, and from day one, it was like he could do no wrong. Lucas was a year older than me, and had this charm about him that everyone seemed to fall for. Teachers liked him even though he never did his homework. Neighbors thought he was a sweet kid, even when he was being a total pain. And my dad? Don't get me started. If Lucas messed up, Dad would pat him on the back and say, "It's okay, you'll get it next time." Meanwhile, if I even made a tiny mistake, I'd get the whole, "I'm disappointed in you" speech. And trust me, I heard that speech a lot. Take school, for example. Lucas was a solid C student. Maybe a D, if we're being honest. But if he managed to scrape by with a B, my dad would act like he just cured cancer. He'd throw Lucas a little celebration, talk about how hard work pays off, and all that nonsense. Me? I was getting A's most of the time, and all I'd hear was, why wasn't it an A+? I mean, what's the point of trying when the bar is set so unevenly? It wasn't just grades either. The favoritism bled into every part of our lives. When Lucas graduated high school, Dad bought him a used car. A nice one, too. Not one of those beaters that barely runs. They had a party with all of Dad's friends, speeches, cake, the whole deal. When I graduated a year later, I got $100 in an envelope and a handshake. No party, no car, just a "congrats, kid." I try not to let it bother me. But how could it not? It felt like I was invisible sometimes. Like, no matter what I did, I'd never be on Lucas's level in Dad's eyes. Lucas wasn't even mean to me, which somehow made it worse. We weren't close, but we didn't hate each other either. He'd occasionally help me with stuff, like fixing my bike or giving me advice about girls, but it always felt like he was doing it out of pity. It wasn't the kind of brotherly bond you see in movies, you know? He had his life, and I had mine. And that was that. The thing about Lucas is that he's smooth. He knows how to talk to people, how to get them on his side. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but he didn't need to be. He had charisma, and that went a long way. My dad always talked about how Lucas had natural leadership qualities, whatever that meant. Meanwhile, I was busting but studying, trying to make something of myself, and it felt like none of it mattered. By the time I was old enough to move out, I couldn't pack my bags fast enough. I went to college out of state, partly because I wanted a good education, but mostly because I needed space. From Dad, from Lucas, from all of it. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe. No one comparing me to Lucas. No one looking over my shoulder. It was liberating. While I was off building my life, Lucas stayed behind and slid right into the family business. My dad owns a small manufacturing company, and Lucas got handed a management position straight out of high school. He didn't even have to try. Meanwhile, I was juggling part-time jobs and classes, barely scraping by to afford tuition. It wasn't jealousy exactly. Okay, maybe a little, but it was mostly frustration. Like, why did everything come so easy for him while I had to fight for every scrap? Even after I graduated and moved back to my hometown, I kept my distance from my family. I wasn't mad at them, not really, but I didn't see the point in hanging around. I'd see them on holidays or for the occasional birthday, but that was it. By then, I'd met Emily, my girlfriend at the time, and I was more focused on building a future with her than trying to win Dad's approval. Emily was everything Lucas wasn't, grounded, kind, and supportive. She made me feel like I mattered, and for the first time in years, I started to feel like maybe I wasn't so invisible after all. But even as I was finding my footing, Lucas was still there in the background, casting his shadow over everything. I didn't realize it at the time, but he wasn't just coasting on Dad's favoritism. He was laying the groundwork for something much bigger, And when it all came crashing down, I'd finally understand just how far Lucas was willing to go to stay on top. When I brought Emily to meet my family, things felt different. For the first time in my life, I actually thought my dad was proud of me. He was warm and welcoming to her, which honestly caught me off guard. Even Lucas was friendly. Too friendly, actually. At first, I thought it was just him being his usual charming self, but over time, it started feeling off. It began small. Lucas would find excuses to come over to my apartment way more often than he ever had before. We'd barely seen each other once every few months before Emily came into the picture, but suddenly, he was dropping by all the time. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. He'd swing by, chat about work or dad, maybe stay for dinner. But as the weeks went on, the visits got more frequent. He'd show up unannounced, often right after Emily got home from work. One night, Emily brought it up. Is it just me? Or has Lucas been coming over a lot lately? She asked casually while we were cleaning up after dinner. I laughed it off. He's probably just bored. You know how he is. She nodded, but I could tell something was bothering her. It's not a big deal, but I don't know. Sometimes it feels like he's hanging around just to talk to me. That caught me off guard. Lucas had always been a bit of a flirt, but I hadn't noticed anything outright inappropriate. Still, I decided to keep an eye on things. A few days later, Lucas showed up again. It was around 8 p.m., and Emily and I had just sat down to watch a movie after a long day at work. The knock on the door felt more like an intrusion than a visit. I opened it, and there he was, holding a six-pack like we were about to have a guy's night. Hey man, he said, grinning. Thought I'd stop by. I hesitated. It's kind of late. Emily and I were just about to. Oh, I won't stay long. He interrupted, already stepping inside. Emily gave him a polite smile, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. He stayed for almost 2 hours, talking mostly to Emily about random stuff. Movies, restaurants, even her job. I barely got a word in. After he left, I turned to Emily. Okay, yeah, that was weird. I don't want to make it a thing, she said carefully. But maybe you could talk to him? Set some boundaries? She was right. Lucas didn't mean any harm. At least, I didn't think he did. But his constant presence was starting to feel invasive. The next day, I called him. I figured a phone call would make it less awkward. Hey, Lucas, I started, trying to keep it light. Look, I appreciate you coming around and all, but Emily and I have been super busy lately. Maybe we could keep visits to the weekends or something. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What's this about? He asked, his tone suddenly defensive. It's not about anything, I said quickly. It's just that we need some space, you know? You've been dropping by a lot, and it's getting hard to juggle everything. He let out a short laugh. Wow. All right, I guess I'll stop bothering you. It's not like that, Lucas. Just cut back a bit, okay? He hung up without saying goodbye. I felt bad for about 10 minutes. Then I reminded myself that this wasn't unreasonable. Emily and I were trying to build a life together, and we didn't need Lucas inserting himself into it all the time. For a while, things seemed to settle down. Lucas stopped coming over as often, and when he did, he kept the visits short and polite. I thought the issue was behind us, but it wasn't. Even though Lucas wasn't physically around as much, he still found ways to keep himself in our lives. He started texting Emily more often. Little things like, what's a good spot for dinner? Or what's that show you mentioned again? She'd always show me the messages. And while nothing about them was inappropriate, the frequency was unsettling. I brought it up to Emily one night. Do you think Lucas texts you a little too much? She shrugged. I guess, but it's never anything weird. He probably just sees me as a friend. Yeah, maybe, I said, though I wasn't convinced. Lucas didn't do anything without a reason. Still, I didn't want to overreact and make Emily uncomfortable. So I let it go for now. Things seemed to simmer down after that. Lucas only dropped by once or twice a month, usually on weekends, and his interactions with Emily stayed surface level. I thought I'd finally managed to draw the line. But looking back, I can see now that Lucas wasn't backing off. He was just waiting. By 2015, I thought my life was finally on track. Emily and I were happy together, raising our 2 daughters, Lily and Sophia. Work was steady, and while I didn't have much of a relationship with Lucas anymore, I figured that was for the best. He was still Dad's golden boy, running things at the family company. I had built my own career outside of it, so I didn't think about it much. It felt like we'd all found our places, and I was okay with mine. Then everything came crashing down. It started with a phone call from my dad one summer afternoon. "You need to come over now," he said, his voice sharp and cold. He didn't explain anything, just hung up after that. I assumed something had gone wrong with the business, or maybe a family emergency, but I had no idea what was waiting for me. When I walked into my dad's house, the tension hit me like a wall. Dad was pacing the living room, his face red with anger. Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen like she'd been crying. And then there was Lucas leaning against the wall with this smug, satisfied look on his face. My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" I asked, looking between them. Dad didn't waste any time. He threw a folder onto the coffee table. "Care to explain this?" I picked it up, flipping through pages of bank statements, emails, and invoices all tied to my name. They showed huge amounts of money being funneled out of the family business, directly into an account I supposedly controlled. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. None of this made sense. I don't know what this is," I stammered. "Oh, don't play dumb." Dad snapped. "You stole from me, from the company. You think I wouldn't find out?" I tried to defend myself, but my voice felt small against his fury. "I didn't do this. I don't even work for the company. Why would I?" "Exactly," Lucas interrupted, his voice calm but full of venom. "You didn't even work there, yet somehow all this money went to you. Doesn't add up, does it?" My head was spinning. "This isn't mine. Someone must have." "Enough," Dad shouted, cutting me off. "You've embarrassed this family enough. I trusted you." I looked at Emily, hoping for some kind of support, but the way she was staring at me, it was like she didn't even know me. "You lied to me," she said softly, her voice shaking. "All this time, and you were hiding this?" "I didn't do this," I said, desperate now. "Emily, you know me. You really think I'd steal from my own family?" "I don't know what to think anymore," she replied, her voice cold. Lucas chimed in again, shaking his head like he was disappointed. I didn't want to believe it either, but the evidence doesn't lie. That smug look on his face, it finally clicked. "This was you," I said, pointing at him. "You set me up." Lucas laughed, low and mocking. "You're grasping at straws, man." Before I could say anything else, Dad slammed his hand on the table. "Get out," he said. "I don't want to see you again." "Dad, please." "Out." I left, my ears ringing and my heart pounding. By the time I got home, Emily had already packed up a few bags and was getting ready to leave. "I need time to think," she said, barely looking at me. "I'm taking the girls to my mom's." "Emily, don't do this." I pleaded. "I didn't do anything wrong. You have to believe me." But she didn't. She left that night, and I didn't hear from her for days. The fallout was brutal. Within a week, my dad had made it clear to the entire family what he thought I'd done. Lucas, of course, was right there to back him up, spreading the story far and wide. Suddenly, I was the family pariah. Relatives stopped answering my calls, friends distanced themselves, and rumors spread like wildfire. And Lucas? He slipped right into the spot I'd been kicked out of. He became Dad's right-hand man, running the company like it was his birthright. I even heard through the grapevine that Dad was planning to hand over the entire business to him. Meanwhile, I was left with nothing. No job, no family, no way to clear my name. It wasn't just personal. Professionally, the accusations followed me everywhere. My boss called me into his office not long after everything blew up. "I'm sorry, but we can't keep you on," he said, trying to sound sympathetic. "We can't afford the risk." I couldn't even argue. The evidence Lucas had fabricated was airtight. Emails, bank records, everything pointed to me. No one was going to believe my word over hard documents. By the end of the month, I had lost everything. My job, my family, my reputation. Lucas had taken everything from me. And the worst part was that no one seemed to care. To them, I was the villain, the thief who betrayed his own blood. But deep down, I knew the truth. Lucas had been planning this for years, and I'd walked right into his trap. After everything fell apart, I didn't know where to start. My dad disowned me, my wife left with the kids, and I was out of a job. My name was mud in my hometown. Every time I walked into a store, I felt like people were whispering about me. I couldn't even look my neighbors in the eye anymore. It was like Lucas had ripped the ground out from under me, and I was free falling with no end in sight. I spent a couple of months in that fog, barely getting by. My savings dried up fast, and I couldn't even land an interview because every place I applied to knew my name. I knew staying in town wasn't an option anymore. One day, I packed up what little I had left, just clothes, some books, and my laptop, and decided to move to a city a couple of hours away. It wasn't glamorous, but it was far enough that I could start fresh. I rented this tiny studio apartment in a rundown part town. The walls were so thin, I could hear my neighbors arguing every night, and the place smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how much I cleaned. But it was cheap, and that was all I could afford. I picked up a couple of odd jobs, freelance work mostly, just to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to do. The hardest part was the loneliness. I had gone from having a family, a career, and a place in the world to sitting alone in a dingy apartment, eating instant noodles for dinner. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake replaying everything in my head, wondering how I could have stopped Lucas from pulling the rug out from under me. The thought of Emily and the girls hurt the most. I'd stare at pictures of them on my phone until I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I couldn't call Emily. She'd made that clear, but I sent her a couple of texts asking how the kids were doing. She never replied. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living like that. If I was going to survive, I had to find something, anything to hold on to. So I started small. I made myself a routine. Wake up, look for jobs, work whatever gigs I could find, and hit the gym. I figured if I couldn't fix my life right away, I could at least try to feel human again. A turning point came in early 2018 when I ran into Daniel, an old friend from college. I was grabbing a cheap coffee at this hole-in-the-wall cafe when I heard someone say my name. I looked up, and there he was, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Man, it's been years," he said, pulling me into a hug. Daniel had been the quiet, nerdy guy in our group back in school, but now he looked sharp, confident. We got to talking, and I told him a bit about what had happened. Not everything, just enough for him to know I wasn't in a great place. Turns out Daniel had started his own consulting firm and was looking to expand. "Listen," he said, "I need smart people I can trust. Why don't you come work with me? We'll start small, see how it goes." I almost laughed. "You sure about that? My track record isn't exactly squeaky clean." Daniel waved it off. "If you're willing to work hard, that's all I care about. The rest? We'll figure it out." I didn't say yes right away. Part of me was scared of hope, like maybe this was too good to be true. But after thinking it over for a few days, I called him back and said I was in. The job wasn't glamorous at first. It was mostly grunt work, research, spreadsheets, and a lot of late nights. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a purpose. I was doing something productive, something that mattered. Daniel introduced me to Ryan, another guy on the team, who quickly became a good friend. Ryan was about Lucas's age, but unlike Lucas, he was genuine. He even got me into working out more seriously. And we'd hit the gym together after work. Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild. By the end of that year, I was in a better place. Not great, but better. I wasn't just scraping by anymore. I had a steady income, a small circle of supportive people, and even a therapist who was helping me unpack all the crap Lucas had dumped on me. I still thought about Emily and the girls every day. I wanted to reach out to explain what had really happened, but I didn't have the courage. Without proof of my innocence, what was the point? Besides, they seemed to be doing fine without me. Emily had moved on, and I heard through the grapevine that Lucas was spending a lot of time with her and the kids. That part hurt the most. It was like he hadn't just taken my life. He'd stepped into it like it was his all along. But even as I carried that weight, I reminded myself this wasn't the end. I had hit rock bottom, sure, but I was climbing back up. Slowly, painfully, but I was getting there. And one day, I promised myself I'd find a way to set the record straight. For me, for Emily, and for the girls. Lucas might have won the battle, but the war wasn't over yet. By early 2023, I'd made peace with the fact that I might never get justice. Lucas had taken everything from me, my family, my reputation, and my place in the world, and gotten away with it. But I had built something new. My consulting work with Daniel and Ryan was thriving, and I had finally started feeling like a person again. Sure, I still carry the scars, but I told myself it was enough to just keep moving forward. Then, out of nowhere, the past came crashing back. It started with a message on social media from someone I hadn't thought about in years. Sarah, Lucas's old flame. At first, I ignored it. What could she possibly want after all this time? She kept messaging, and curiosity got the better of me. I finally responded, and we set up a call. When her face popped up on the screen, she looked rough, like she hadn't slept in days. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, she started, her voice shaky. But I need to tell you something. It's about Lucas. The mention of his name made my stomach turn. What about him? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Sarah took a deep breath. Back in 2015, when everything went down, Lucas, he set you up. All of it. The fraud, the emails, the bank transfers. It was him. I helped him. I just stared at her, the words not sinking in at first. You what? I'm so sorry, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. He convinced me to go along with it. Said you deserved it, that you were trying to take everything from him. He made it sound like you're the bad guy. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. For years, I'd known deep down that Lucas was behind it all. But hearing it confirmed was like reliving the whole nightmare. Why are you telling me this now? I finally managed to ask. Sarah looked down, fiddling with her hands. I couldn't live with it anymore. I've been in therapy, trying to deal with the guilt. And, well, my fiancé found out. He said if I wanted to move forward with him, I had to make things right. Her words hit me like a freight train. For years, I'd carried the weight of Lucas's betrayal, thinking no one would ever believe me. And now, here was Sarah practically handing me the evidence I needed to clear my name. Do you have proof? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She nodded. I saved some of the messages. Lucas didn't know, but I kept screenshots of our conversations. Emails, too. I couldn't bring myself to delete them. She sent the files over while we were still on the call. As I went through them, my hands started shaking. There it was. Undeniable proof that Lucas had forged the bank transfers, fabricated the emails, and planted the evidence to frame me. There were even messages where he bragged about how easy it was to turn Dad and Emily against me. I didn't know whether to scream or cry. Why didn't you come forward sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was scared, she admitted. Lucas made it clear what would happen if I talked. He's not who everyone thinks he is. No kidding. The next day, I met with my lawyer, James, and laid everything out for him. He spent hours going through the files, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. This is more than enough to take him to court, he said. Defamation, fraud, you name it. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. But it wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about exposing Lucas for who he really was. He hadn't just hurt me. He'd manipulated everyone around him. tearing apart lives to boost his own ego. We started the process of filing a lawsuit, but I knew this wasn't going to be quick or easy. Lucas had spent years cultivating his image as the perfect son, the golden boy. Taking him down would be a fight, but it was one I was finally ready for. Before anything went public, I called Emily. It was the first time we'd spoken in years, and I could barely get the words out. "I have proof." "Emily," I said, my voice trembling. "Lucas set me up. Everything he accused me of. It was him." She didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I don't know if I can deal with this right now." I didn't push her. I just told her I'd send the files and let her decide for herself. A few days later, she called me back, crying. "I'm so sorry," she said over and over again. I didn't know. I didn't want to believe he could do something like this. It was a step toward closure, but it didn't erase the years of pain. I told her I wasn't ready to rebuild our relationship. Not yet. There was too much water under the bridge. She understood. By mid-2023, the case was in full swing. Lucas's perfect world started crumbling as the evidence piled up. Dad, who had been his biggest supporter, cut ties with him when the truth came out. Emily filed for divorce. And Lucas? He tried to spin the story, claiming Sarah was lying, that I had fabricated the evidence, but no one believed him anymore. It didn't fix everything. It didn't give me back the years I'd lost or the life Lucas had stolen. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The truth was out, and Lucas was finally paying the price for what he'd done. When the truth about Lucas came out, it felt like the weight of the past 8 years had lifted, at least partially. The lawsuit was in motion. Emily had seen the evidence and apologized, and Dad finally understood the kind of person Lucas really was. But even with all of that, I knew there was one last thing I had to do. Confront Lucas face to face. It wasn't something I looked forward to, but I needed to say my piece. After everything he'd taken from me, my family, my reputation, my place in the world, I wasn't going to let him slither away without answering for it. The meeting took place in my lawyer's office. Lucas was legally required to attend as part of the defamation lawsuit. And honestly, I think his lawyer forced him to show up to try to negotiate. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times. But when I walked into that room and saw him sitting there, all those carefully planned words flew out of my head. He looked the same as always. Smug, polished, and completely unbothered. Even now, knowing he'd been exposed, Lucas had the nerve to act like he was the victim in all of this. "Long time no see," he said with a smirk as I sat down. I ignored the jab and turned to my lawyer, James. "Are we good to start?" James nodded, leaning back in his chair. "We're here to discuss potential resolutions before this goes any further in court." Lucas cut in. "Resolutions? You mean his desperate attempt to squeeze money out of me?" He scoffed and leaned back in his chair like he owned the room. "You've always been good at playing the victim." That's when I snapped. "Playing the victim? Are you serious right now?" My voice was steady, but I could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You stole years of my life, Lucas. Years. You took my family, my job, everything I worked for. And for what? To stroke your ego?" He shrugged. "You always thought you were better than me. You needed to be knocked down a peg." "Knocked down a peg?" I repeated, barely believing what I was hearing. "You destroyed my marriage. You turned my daughters against me. You left me with nothing. And for what? Some twisted need to one-up me? You were already Dad's favorite. You had everything handed to you. But that wasn't enough for you, was it?" Lucas didn't respond. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, his smirk faltering. I leaned forward, my voice quiet but firm. "I want you to hear this loud and clear. Lucas, you didn't break me. You tried, and for a while, yeah, you succeeded. But I rebuilt. I found a new life, new people who believe in me. And now, everyone knows exactly who you are." James stepped in before things could escalate further. If we could focus on the terms. But Lucas wasn't done. You think this makes you some kind of hero? He spat, leaning forward now. You think dragging me through court changes anything? You're still nothing without me. You needed me to make your life interesting. I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. You think I need you? Lucas, you're a cautionary tale at best. You didn't just lose me. You lost Dad, Emily, and anyone else who believed in you. You burned your life to the ground, and now you have the audacity to act like you're still in control? Lucas's lawyer finally stepped in, clearly uncomfortable with where things were headed. Let's take a break, he said, glancing nervously between us. After the meeting, I felt drained. Confronting Lucas didn't bring the closure I thought it would. Sure, I got to say my piece, but it didn't erase what he'd done. Still, it felt like a step in the right direction, like I was finally taking my life back. A few weeks later, the court officially ruled in my favor. Lucas was ordered to pay damages, and while the money didn't matter to me, the verdict did. It was a public acknowledgement that I wasn't the villain in this story. I was innocent, and Lucas was the one who had lied, cheated, and destroyed everything in his path. Dad reached out not long after the ruling. He wanted to meet and talk, and for the first time in years, I agreed. The conversation was awkward at first, but eventually he broke down. I was blind, and I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I let Lucas manipulate me, and I failed you. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him, but another part couldn't forget how quickly he turned on me. It's going to take time, I told him honestly, but I appreciate the apology. Emily also reached out, hoping to rebuild some kind of relationship for the sake of the kids. While I wasn't ready to jump back into anything, I agreed to meet with Lily and Sophia. Seeing them again after all those years was both heartbreaking and healing. They'd grown so much, and while they were hesitant at first, I could tell they wanted to reconnect. That was enough for me. As for Lucas, he disappeared from our lives. Rumors swirled about him moving to another state, but I didn't care enough to find out if they were true. He'd burned every bridge he had, and as far as I was concerned, he could live with the ashes. Now, years later, I finally feel like I'm in control of my life again. I've built something real, something Lucas can't touch. The scars he left are still there, but they're a reminder of how far I've come. He may have taken everything from me once, but I'm the one who came out stronger in the end. And that, more than anything, feels like closure.